Hey, what's up, everybody? Marcos Villegas here, being joined via Zoom with Stephen Espinoza, the president of Showtime Sports. Stephen, man, thank you so much for joining me. I'm very excited to come and speak with you about just all things sports and boxing, but I know we touched on it a little bit right now. How has your whole COVID experience been like over there in New York?
Well, I live here in Manhattan, which is obviously the epicenter of everything. And it's been sort of at times disturbing, alarming, and a little bit stressful. But look, I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. The numbers here are certainly going down. It's still kind of scary, but I think there's been a lot more conversations over the last few days about how we start to reopen in some form or the other. So I think that is energizing a lot of people.
Yeah, everybody that I've spoken to, fighter-wise, has had a different experience depending on where they live. Like over here in Orange County, it's not too bad. It's more or less, it's different, but it's not as how you guys are. I would imagine how stressful it is to even just go outside.
Yeah, I look, we've been working from home for over 6 weeks, about 6.5 weeks now. And I've been outside my apartment 3 times. Now, I've got a girlfriend that's high risk. She's got asthma and some autoimmune conditions. So we're playing it super, super safe. And, grocery store and, things like that are high risk. I certainly don't want to bring home anything to her. So look, it's been a lot of Zooms, a lot of emails, and a lot of creative adjustments in here. But it's been interesting, and I think a lot of the habits and practices that we're developing now are probably going to stick with us even when we're through the virus aspect of it.
That's the thing. When is this going to be all finished? And I guess how is this going to impact everything in general? Not only business life, but personal life. Like going forward, it's weird, man. I can't even begin to imagine how people are going to adjust.
Yeah, I mean, it is changed. The way we consume media, the way we interact with each other, how we socialize. It has changed. Zoom as a company. Think of anybody who has sort of benefited more probably from this and from the just being in the right place at the right time. And then there are things like, will they ever come back? We're seeing a lot of theaters under heavy distress. Are we, what's movie viewing going to look like when we come back? Will there be theaters? Will there be less theaters? Or will everything go direct to streaming? There's a lot of things, not just from the health aspect, but other parts of our lives. What is the medical system going to look like? What does community health look like? What does mass transit look like when we start to be more sensitive to these kinds of issues going forward?
The one plus side, I think, is a lot of people have been using this free time to get new skills or come up with new things that they haven't had a chance to do. Have you done anything with this free time, or it's all been grinding?
I wish. I wish, more productive. I mean, we've been relatively busy. I did, successfly help my girlfriend navigate a haircut, which I think is probably she did.
Yeah.
And I've had worse haircuts. I've had many worse haircuts. So it was a lot of YouTube videos and a little bit of hoping and praying. And I guess there's always baseball hats in the worst case scenario, but it turned out not necessary.
Yeah, it doesn't look too shabby, man. It looks good.
No, it's okay. It's definitely respectable. I would go back to her.
You see me, my hair's growing out like crazy, man. I don't trust myself with a pair of clippers at all.
Yeah, YouTube is your friend. You just you take the plunge.
So, the question that any boxing fan seeing this would want to know is, Stephen, when is boxing coming back?
Anybody who says they know is not being honest. And I think anybody who really says they know anything at this point definitively is probably exaggerating. There's just so much we don't know. I think we're going to find out a lot in the next 2 weeks with the course of the disease and how it relates to some of these states reopening. But look, in terms of sports, combat sports, in boxing in particular, are better positioned than most, simply because, it's a smaller group of athletes taking part in it. That's the first piece of it. And it's not 200, 250 traveling members of a professional football team or 150 of a college football team. The numbers are much smaller. But at the same time, it's not NASCAR or tennis, where you can sort of avoid close interaction between your athletes. Obviously that's not possible in boxing. So the real question is, when can those of us who help organize the sport and who manage organizations, when can we sort of look in the mirror and say, look, I can comfortably recommend that everybody who works with me and freelancers and staff go out and go to an event, and I can tell them that they're safe, and I can go with them and feel safe myself. There's going to be some risk going forward. We all know that it's not going to be perfect, but I think there's the aspect of when can we ensure that the risk is minimized, and then there's the question about what is right for community health, because one of the things that is unique to combat sports is you're talking about a ringside position and 2 ambulances for the entire evening of the show. So that's 6-7 hours on a Saturday night. Certainly, that's not something that New York can spare right now. That's not something that a lot of states can spare. Some can't. But we need to get to the point where, occupying those ambulances and taking up some sort of tests is not disadvantaging people who really need it. Because being completely honest, sports shouldn't be the first thing. I know it's important to a lot of people, including me, but no one is saying that we should be taking tests and doctors away from, the real emergency just so people can watch some boxing. So there's that aspect of it. There's the aspect of crowds. I think the assumption is that, we're going to be without crowds for foreseeable future. We're probably going to see smaller cards. Some of the states have already given out guidelines that limit the amount of rounds on a card, and it's much smaller than you would typically see. I know one state that's limiting it to 44 total rounds on a card, and that's in a complete card, not the TV portion, the card as a whole. So that's basically 2 12-rounders and 2 10-rounders, and you've got an event that's a lot smaller than we're used to. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. MLB and NBA are grappling with this right now. I think a lot of us are looking at those two and seeing how they deal with these issues, because they'll probably be back in business probably before we start doing boxing events, or at least they'll have a plan in place. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that we are safeguarding the athletes and everyone associated with the event.
I've seen interviews that Bob Arum's done that he feels that Top Rank will be operational by June. I've also heard other things that maybe we might get some fights in July. Is that what it's kind of looking for you guys as well, that around that time frame, you guys are hoping we can get something going?
I would say probably, realistically, I'd say it's probably July. I'm not going to say that we can't in June. But we're basically at, let's call it just about May 1 right now as we're recording this. And if you were going to do something in June, let's just say we could make that commitment now. Even now, you'd only be giving guys 4 or 5 weeks of training. And like we've said, most of the guys do not have access to a gym. Certainly guys in California, New York, some of the other states where there have been strict lockdowns, they're going to need more than 4 weeks. So, from our perspective, this isn't, this shouldn't be a race. It's not about a race. We're as anxious to get back, and there's certainly a business opportunity, but we're not going to come back just to come back and do fights. There's no point in rushing back and forcing fighters into fights before they're fully prepared. You're not going to get a good product, and you're probably going to risk some injuries to the fighters as well. So, I think we're going to sit back, not rush to be the first one out there, but when we're out there, we're going to be doing fights that matter. We're not just going to come out with fights for the sake of doing fights and saying, okay, well, here are some guys that we could get ready, and you guys are starving for boxing, so you'll watch whatever we program. I don't think that's a good idea for anybody. Once we are clear what the parameters are, we have a clear protocol in place, then we'll start layering in the fights and giving every fighter an adequate time to prepare. And I think that's going to make for a really interesting back half of the year.
You kind of alluded to it, how because of this, we're going to get, smaller cards with, fewer rounds. But my thing is, like, I guess ultimately, like, what will be like the form that boxing does come back in?
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, there's one of the things we haven't touched on is Vegas, and how does Vegas recover? Vegas is obviously a big part of boxing. It's a big part of entertainment. But you look at the things that that now draw people to Vegas. There's all the entertainment, the shows, the concerts, music festivals, sporting events. All of those are not happening for the time being. It's restaurants, high-end restaurants. Those are going to be impacted once they open. And there's obviously gambling. And I'm not sure how you have a craps table or a blackjack table with social distancing. And there's a bunch of people in Vegas who are working on that exactly. But so much of the Vegas business is built on group events, concerts, shows, conventions, and conferences. And, it's not as if once we give everyone a green light, that is immediately going to rush back to its previous level. It's going to take a while for people to get comfortable, and rightly so. And I don't know that businesses are going to be having conventions in Las Vegas, in the near future. And maybe that's something that goes away altogether. So I think what you're going to see is sort of a strange combination of events and venues going forward. If you really want to do a fight, there are places to do a fight right now. Again, we don't think it'll come off as the best experience, but if you really wanted to, you could go to one of these states, most of which are not traditional boxing states, and do an event. Like, we may have word pretty shortly on Texas. That's certainly an active state in boxing with a big boxing fan base. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on a sound stage or in a closed environment. There are venues out there that would be willing to do it, to have the event without the crowd, and there are states that could host it really at this point or in the very near future.
What other commissions have you heard from that have said, like, hey, we have stuff in place, it's open if you guys choose to?
Well, Florida and Texas, Florida right now is able to do it. Texas is, thinks that in the near future they will be able to do it. New York, I think it's going to be a while before they turn to sporting events. I think California may be ready for sporting events without crowds relatively soon. Nevada, it seems like a bit of a question mark, because there's not a lot of back and forth between their governor and the mayor of Vegas, and there's a lot of concerns that are unique to Vegas and the casinos. So I think what you'll see is probably a lot of promoters going out with smaller shows initially, 10 rounders or less, and certainly not the big names. And we could certainly do that as well, but I don't think that's the best way to go. I think people want, premium entertainment. They want big fights, especially the fact that they've been hungry for it isn't an opportunity for us to, it shouldn't be an opportunity for us to sort of feed them lower level stuff. When we get back, we want to get back at the top of our game, and that's what we're working toward.
Did you see the card that happened over the weekend in Nicaragua? I'm curious to see like what your thoughts were on that.
It was interesting. I don't know about the safety or the advisability of sort of spraying fighters down. I didn't expect that aspect of it. Which they were spraying them down with some disinfectant. I think in terms of the crowd, I think it's probably an important thing to keep track of. They had what I heard, roughly 700 people in a venue that was available for a much larger amount. It's not as if they closed it down and limited it that amount, but that's the number of people who came out and were comfortable going to an event. So, again, it's sort of like with reopening the economy, with crowds at events, whether it's a concert or movie theater. I think a lot of the movie theaters, you're hearing them say, sure, we could open now, but, we don't think people are ready to come back. So it doesn't make sense for us to open. So I think, part of this is the medical advice and community advice. Part of this is sort of what are the psychological scars, so to speak. At what point do we become confident enough to go back to sitting next to a complete stranger at a sporting event or a movie theater?
With that being said, when you guys do have an event, how is it going to look like? Is it going to be like a skeleton crew, or are you guys going to have like the normal people there, or are media going to be there? Like how is a sporting event now with all this that's going on?
All good questions, and I think yes, the idea right now, and things change daily, and as we learn things in different protocols, the idea right now is to keep the crew as minimal as possible, and have some sort of testing protocols in place for not just the fighters but others, and have somewhere where you have control of the venue. Hopefully both, that's not being cycled with a lot of different people and potentially becoming a risk in itself. So there's all those aspects, but then again, there's, I think people your age or my age, you may look at it and say, the tendency is, well, we're not really at risk. And that may or may not be the case. Certainly, it seems like there's somewhat less risk to younger groups, but many of us have risk right near us. You think about Leo Santa Cruz. His father has been fighting cancer for several years, and that's a risk. We have some of our talent have had a spouse with a serious medical condition that they're living with. There are people on our staff who live with elderly parents, or who have pregnant spouses at home. All of those things come into play. So it's not just, hey, are you safe at the event, but are you comfortable returning home back into your own environment and exposing your loved ones to potential risk? And how do we address those as well? And that's a risk, for everybody who travels to an event, not just the fighters in the corner.
I've thought about like how a promoter could pull off an event. And my big thing that comes to it is, all this time, like I've had really time to kind of flesh it out. You mentioned it, the cards have to be small. It has to have a very minimum amount of fighters fighting on the card. But with that, I was thinking like, okay, well, where is like corner A, corner B? Like sometimes fighters share corners. And then like, even prior to that, like how are you guys going to be able to like track who's getting tested with the camp? Because they have to bring people in camp to spar with them. They have a whole team. It gets a little complicated at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's why, that's one of the reasons people are continuing to ask questions of the UFC, because it is a complex issue. And when you say you're taking precautions, sure, temperature is, one way to screen, but we all know there are asymptomatic carriers, and that's not going to help. And so there's a lot of questions. Okay, what are the safety precautions? Okay, enough with the vague generalities. What are they in place? And it's not something that anybody can come up with in a few days. I don't know if there's going to need to be an organization that is engaged to do the testing and track the testing. I know, certainly, ringside physicians, it's not their role. It's certainly not promoter roles. So if we have access to tests, we want to test everybody before they interact and mingle on an event. Who's going to do that? Who's going to keep track of it? Where do we get those kinds of, and who's testing and what are the parameters? Who's interpreting those tests? That's a whole complicated, that's almost like imposing an entirely new drug testing protocol on the sport. It's not drug testing, but it's medical testing. And it's, in the near term, that's the safest alternative. And it's complex to get that actually implemented in place.
And then not only that is when they arrive there, are they going to have to stay after? Can they go back home right away? It's when I started really thinking about it, I was like, man, this is to make sure that everyone really is safe. There has to be a long list of things done.
Yeah, and that's why when you read about the NBA or the MLB, they're talking about, hey, maybe we do the NBA playoffs all in Vegas and they all stay in one place and it's virtually on lockdown. Because the problem is, you go out to dinner, the night before the fight, and look, we've all seen the studies. We've seen, some of the breakdowns of how it's transmitted. You go to a restaurant, you can come home and 2 or 3 people infected, and then the next day there's 30 more at the event. So you're going to have multiple testing. You're going to have some restrictions and complete buy-in from everyone on the event that they're not sort of intermingling. And this is just going to become part of the sport for at least the foreseeable future until things dramatically change.
For you to be comfortable putting on a show.
I mean, and look.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not just us within the sport. I mean, look. I think every element of the sports business, like venues, are going to need to, like, if you ran a venue right now, I think you're already thinking about, okay, how do I change food service, in the light to minimize the risk? We've already heard of that, like fewer buffets and more prepared food. How do you handle people coming in and out of the arena? Do you increase the number of bathrooms so there's not such a crowd there? Like, there's all kinds of things about the sporting experience, whether it's the television production or whether the event itself or whether it's the venue, which we're going to have to make accommodations in the near future, certainly until there's a vaccine at least.
For you to be comfortable to put on a show, what framework do you have to see, or what are you going to do to make sure that you and your crew are comfortable putting on a show that's safe?
So that's an ongoing conversation with experts, and I'm certainly not holding myself out as one, but it has to be something more than, well, we took everybody's temperature and asked them to fill out a survey, and everyone says everyone's temperature is fine, and they say they feel fine. That's not a safe way of going about business. That's basically cross your fingers and hope that it works out. And obviously, if anybody, if a fighter or anybody involved in the production or the commission went home and infect a child or a pregnant wife or anything like that, then everybody involved in that would feel terrible. So it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be risk, but I think without access to tests and ready access to tests, multiple tests potentially, I don't think that you can truly be say that you're taking the necessary precautions to make things as safe as possible.
The other thing that I've been thinking about is how is this going to change the business of boxing in terms of how much the fighters are making, if there's pay-per-views, purchases, all that. Give me your thoughts on that. How is this going to impact the business of boxing?
Well, I mean, one question is how long this goes on. We could be in a scenario where, at the extreme, maybe we're not in front of crowds for a year. Let's just say that, at some point, when you talk about real crowds, maybe it's the end of the year, maybe it's next spring. In that regard, then the sport becomes, a TV sport, and a little bit, you see a little bit with WWE now and what they've done. To me, it just always reminds me of the old school pro wrestling shows, where there were like 20 people sitting around in folding chairs, and it was clear as in a studio. So we definitely don't want it to look like that.
Like a WCW show.
Yeah.
I remember those.
We've seen those, and yeah. I mean, it's a little bit like what WWE looks like. In WWE, given the nature of the sport, I mean, I think that's one where the lack of a crowd dramatically changes the experience. Certainly it will change in boxing, but boxing, there's so much drama in the ring that I'm convinced there is enough excitement and adrenaline to go around that even if you don't have the crowd, you're still going to feel it. There's real good questions here about, what does this do for the business, going forward? More people home watching TVs, may lead to, better ratings and, larger visibility for the sport. It could mean that the financial structure has to change differently because, we may not be having gate revenues for some period of time. We'll have to see how the sport addresses fewer fights happening. And you've seen it, on big fight days, you're starting a card at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. You might have 10 or 12 bouts on a card. That's not going to happen in the near future. So those are going to have to be separate cards. And it may not be, all of those may not be televised. So I think more than ever, I think the mid-size and small promoters are going to be key. And those regional shows and local shows are going to be really key to continuing to get the sport going and to ramp up and get the fighters the fights that they need, because you just won't have the ability to load everything on one big card the way we used to.
Terrence Crawford did an interview a few days ago, and he brought up an interesting point. He said, well, if he's fighting without a crowd, because he makes money off of the revenue as part of his purse, he wants to get paid more. And I thought that was an interesting point. What do you make of that?
Well, first, I don't know that anyone deserves to be paid more. I think what he was trying to say is, I don't want to be reduced because, if my minimum is $3 million, I don't want to be offered $2 million because there's no gate. So I hope he wasn't saying that his minimum is $3 million, but since there's no crowd, he's due $4 million. It sort of depends on what each fighter's deal with the promoter is. But it's it varies promoter to promoter and and fighter to fighter, whether if it's a Gervonta Davis who's demonstrated that he can sell tickets in a lot of different places, if it's the Wilder Fury rematch, if it's something like that, then you're going to try and wait as long as possible so that you have those revenues. But the finances are going to change. Look, for all I know, our people are going to look to us, promoters and fighters, and say, look, you need to bump up your license fees a little bit to make up for the fact that there aren't crowds, there isn't a gate. So there will be some adjustment, no question, on all the financial models for all of this.
Will we see pay-per-views? Can we see those top tier type of fights, or do you think because everybody is going to be penny pinching, a lot of people are going to be out of work, that it might not be a good idea to have pay-per-views in the near future? Or will pay-per-views be at a lower price?
It's another good question because certainly with this amount of people unemployed, and another group of people taking either temporary layoffs or pay reductions, financial resources of the audience, is a real concern. So I think that's part of it. But I think what we've seen, so far, is that for the premium events, people will find a way. If you are offering something that's truly premium, and that's a big deal, a must-have, people are in the mood of needing something at home and needing an escape, needing something in entertainment, and I think it's possible. What I don't think is advisable, I think the change that needs to be made is everything that happens in the near term really has to be relatively big pay-per-views. Borderline pay-per-views and even borderline events are not going to do well. Like, I don't believe that, maybe in the short run, in the immediate future, people are so desperate that they'll watch just about anything. But that's not a good recipe for the audience. I think if you polled boxing fans and say, would you rather have, so-so fights coming back in June, or would you rather wait until July and have like meaningful fights? I think everyone would say, let's wait for July. So, I think for the big events, what people want is big events, and those will always do well, whether they're pay-per-view or not. But in this period of time, if it's a marginal event, it's not going to survive.
Do you think prices would go down a little bit to reflect what's happening with everybody being on unemployment or having a hard time?
It's an interesting, a really interesting question. It's been debated, as long as I've been in the sport. So the real question, or the real issue is nobody wants to be the guinea pig. Nobody, the thought is, and certainly a lot of social media discussion is, well, $70 a little too steep. I would have bought it if it's 50, or 40 or whatever it is. And that's a fairly common comment that I see on social media. Whether in fact that's actually true, remains to be seen. And, obviously if you're going from $70 pay-per-views, and doing one buy range, you're going to reduce it down to 50, unless you are increasing the buys, you're giving up money. So no one wants to be the guy that finds out, I took $20 less per buy and it didn't get me any additional buys, and then they're going to figure it out. But honestly, I think it's overdue. I would like to see some of that experimentation, and maybe this is the opportunity to do it.
So we had a bunch of fights scheduled, and now because of this, the pushed back. So when boxing starts coming back, how does that all get sorted out? Do the guys that had dates re-get their dates, or do they get reshuffled? Like, who gets what?
Yeah, another really interesting question, and particularly because you're not going to have the ability to fit all the fights on one card like we're used to anyway. I think the first thing to be rescheduled would be the fighters who were scheduled and their fights are still there and they're ready to go. For us, we had the Luis Neri fight. We had in the David Benavidez event were the two events that were up next. So I would say, just in the abstract, those would logically be the guys who are first up. Not saying that they'll be the first event, but it makes sense. If you're already in training camp, and had to interrupt it a couple weeks before, you probably should be first in line to get an event once things get rolling again. But there will be, without question, it's going to be a free for all, because there's not just boxing has a lot of a backlog to make up, but every other sport as well. So there's going to be a race for venues, for dates, for television slots. It's going to be, for a sports fan, it's going to be great, because there's just going to be, once the dam breaks, like, you're going to be flooded with all these previously canceled sporting events.
Yeah, it's gonna be like the floodgates opening, because we're gonna have, and even with boxing, we're gonna have there's this big fight here on the same night as this fight, because they just gotta get that inventory out.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely believe so. So, I mean, we'll see. And look, we may need to go international. There may be countries overseas, particularly in the Far East, that, maybe they progressed far beyond where we are. And maybe that's where some of the events are, at least initially. So, we got to keep in mind that boxing is a global sport. The pandemic is a global issue. But different countries, their territories are making different progress on it.
Now, I got to ask you, Stephen, this whole Fight Island thing that's come up, obviously, you're ahead of a major network. I can't wrap my head around it sometimes when I think about it. What do you make of this Fight Island that Dana White wants to put on to hold international fights?
Well, it's starting to look more and more like it probably won't be necessary. I understand, look, there's the issue of international fighters, and there's really hasn't been very much conversation about when the U.S. will be open for international travel. So that's one issue that's only solved by something like that. But again, UFC has gone internationally, and there are countries in Europe, in particular the Far East, that seem to have made fairly well progress and are ahead there. So I'm not sure that you have to outfit an island. I think it's a good talking point and an interesting conversation starter. But ultimately, we were. I think the initial plan was that, this quote unquote Fight Island would be, already in use. And now it looks like, it'll be late May, early June. And at that point, unless something unexpected happens, you probably will have some flexibility and at least be able to do a good chunk of the events, without resorting to that. But, the thing that it, comes back to me is safety and community health. Just going to an island doesn't really minimize the risk that much, at least not incrementally more, than, being somewhere and just taking care to sort of quarantine, or at least isolate yourself around an event. You still need all of those things that we talked about before: access to testing and people to, accurately record those, and, someone following up to make sure that everyone around the event, personnel, TV production, the corners, all of those people are safe and tested and aren't, exposed to any risk of infection just before the event. So whether you're on an island or otherwise, I would think that actually not on an island is probably easier to fulfill all those requirements than driving all of those requirements to some offshore island.
So no calling Al anytime soon and trying to purchase an island.
No, I would love to. Trust me, there's nothing. I would even. I'll settle for the Bahamas or something like that. And it's been a while, but we did a fight there not that long ago. Look, if I had to pick, that's where I would say. But I think for the time being, I think it's a good conversation starter and a good marketing plan. I don't think it's particularly safe. To be going this quickly, and I don't think the idea of an island adds that much to it. And I think there's a reason why we haven't heard details of the medical testing and the safety protocols. It's certainly up to each promotion to handle that information however they like, but I don't see why it wouldn't be publicized if you're that confident in the safety and the effectiveness of all the protocols you have in place. Then I think you want to make everybody comfortable, and you want to tell everyone about it, as opposed to keeping it something that's secret behind the scenes and not widely discussed.
What fights did you guys have planned before all this broke out? Because I know the Benavidez fight had a date already, and there was a few others. I know there was plans for Tank and Leo. I heard LA in May, but what fights were down the line?
Tank versus Leo was pretty close, very, very close. And that fight would make a lot of sense in LA. That's a Staples Center fight. Could be a Vegas fight or a Texas fight too. But I think there was that one. We were talks about one or both of the Charlos. We talked about Broner coming back. Those are the guys who are sort of next up, for the most part. And then there, some of the younger guys, Jaron Ennis was up, Stephen Fulton, who we saw in January and was impressive, somebody that we've been looking to get back. So I think those are the guys who are sort of on the immediate, the short list for getting back in the ring pretty quickly.
So how does the talent system work with you guys? Like, do they appear on Fox for one fight and then they go to Showtime for one fight and they go back to Fox? Like, how is that split up?
It's it'll be an interesting question. I think last year was a year of adjustment, and I don't think there's a lot of certainty for us or for Fox or a lot of certainty overall in the market in general. I do think that it will be a little bit more logical in terms of weight classes or specific fighters that you're seeing clearly on one network versus another. But I want all the good fights. We want all the good fights. Fox wants all the good fights. The reality, there's enough to go around, and particularly when we're not doing these huge big cards, you're going to need multiple events to take care of all those fighters. It's going to take more events to service the same number of fighters than it did before, given that we're going to have smaller cards. So I think there'll be plenty of high level stuff to go around.
Going back to the Tank versus Leo fight, so I guess what predicament does that put that fight in now with all this that's happening?
That's one of those fights that could definitely do a crowd, can do a good gate number. With Tank, doing well over $2 million in his last go in Atlanta. That's real money, and so the question is really one of uncertainty, because no one has really said, forget it, you're not having crowds at sporting events, until January of next year. No one's been that clear. There have been sort of suggestions. Gavin Newsom has said it's tough for him to see, or these people on his staff have said it's tough for them to see crowds at sporting events before the end of the year. And other people have speculated, but no one has really said it, because I think if someone said, look, there's no chance that you are getting crowds before May or March of 2021, then I think everyone would go full speed ahead and just do fights now. The question is, and the difficult question is, if there is, 10%, 20% chance, 30% chance that maybe crowds are back in some states by the end of the year. Maybe Texas has crowds by the end of the year. Do Tank and Leo want to wait and take the risk that, maybe they don't, you waited for nothing? Or do you want to just go ahead and get a paycheck and get a decent paycheck and take the risk that, if you had waited 3 or 4 months or 6 months, that you could have gotten a little bit more money? I think it'll come down to the fighters. It's ultimately their choice in terms of their activity level and timing and things like that. But it's a tough call. All the uncertainty makes it really tough to make decisions.
Do you see those top fighters electing to have stay busy fights as opposed to big fights because of that reason, because there's no crowd and it cuts into the revenue?
I don't think so. I get the sense in talking with some of the fighters and promoters that it's the opposite. The more that these guys are out, these guys and women are out, the more they really want to be back in meaningful fights. So I haven't heard tune-up opponents or tune-up fights. No one's really talking about that, at this point. I think everyone's saying, give me the biggest fight that I can make. I'm tired of sitting around at home. I want to get out there. I want to be in front of people. I want to be doing big events. I want to be moving my career forward. So I think, I'm optimistic that we're going to see really good fights, in the second half of this year.
Just overall, the pantheon of sports, how big of a hit is this going to be, you see, for sports and just in general? And how different will sports be a year from now, you think?
Look, it's going to be a tough period of time. If you look at the NBA, for example, they were dealing with, early in the season, the China controversy, and they had some financial losses based on some of the things that happened there. And then a lot of these team owners, not just in NBA, but in others, also have other businesses that are not doing well. Some of their other businesses are doing extremely well. But I think sports is one segment of the industry, in some ways very similar to the rest, and in some ways not. And the ways it is similar is I don't think that every franchise owner, just because they're wealthy, is immune from the financial effects. We've seen it. We're seeing it across some of the European leagues, of leagues and franchises already being in financial distress. I think it's a potential across the U.S. In some of those leagues going forward. I think the biggest question mark that really that is on everyone's mind is the crowd aspect of it. Worst case, people aren't comfortable in getting back in a crowd until they have a vaccine, which maybe is next spring, maybe it takes longer. So, I think there's the biggest pressing question in long run is not just for sports, but all events, concert and movie theaters, Broadway. When is it going to be medically advisable that we can all get together again in crowds like that? And B, when are people sort of comfortable with doing that? Because they're two separate issues and they might happen on two separate timetables. But I do think, on some level, again, it's the biggest events are going to do the best. I can see people saying, look, for a marginal event, forget it, I'll stay at home. If it's a really big event, and people are sure at some level of safety, I think they'll be just as enthusiastic as they have been. But, in a lot of ways, there may be some really serious long-term changes to venues, to the presentation of the sport, to the way we train the sport. All of this is up for grabs.
Do you foresee it bankrupting individuals, teams, boxing promoters?
I think so. We're certainly going to certainly financial pressures on every segment of the marketplace. I'm not going to point out names, and I can't identify any specific ones, but the longer this goes, the greater the chances that there is long-term financial repercussions. Baseball in particular is, I think, one where there's a lot of financial pressure because there has been some money flowing to the players at this point for the deal, but no one has any revenue from this season at all. With the NBA, at least you had most of the season, 3/4 of the season done, and got some TV money, got some venue money. Baseball needs desperately to come back to salvage something of a season, because every day that goes forward is a day that they're not playing and collecting revenue. So I think that's one of those situations where the timing was particularly bad for Major League Baseball, and that may lead to bigger pressures there than other parts of the sports industry.
Yo, you, yes, you. Thank you so much for watching this video, and make sure to subscribe for more videos of your favorite fighters over here on Fight Up TV, and give us a follow online as well at Fight Up TV on Twitter and on Instagram. We appreciate it, guys.